Hello, so this is another video looking back at one of my favourite video games from the past, and it's Half-Life, but not the original Half-Life 2. If you imagine that Half-Life is one of the progenitors of all the FPS genre that we have now, well, Half-Life 2 was its better, bigger brother. The graphics were better, the physics engine was better, gameplay was better, the scripting was better, the voice acting was better, pretty much everything was Half-Life but ramped up. In fact, it was Half-Life 2, which is what you expect from the sequel, everything to be bigger and better. And in terms of gameplay and in terms of story, this is my second favourite FPS. Last week you saw Fear, which is my favourite FPS. This week we're looking at Half-Life 2. Now the first thing to say is Half-Life 2 is a classic. What do I mean by a classic? Well, it's quite old. The advantage of quite old games that are really good is they'll run on virtually anything. And that's not surprising because this is a Valve product, so this will work on Valve OS, Mac OS, Windows 10 down to Windows XP I think it'll even work on. And on my PC this thing is running at 300 frames per second with a low of 290 frames per second, and that's while recording. And to be honest, the graphics aren't bad. If you've got a mid-range PC, then the graphics on Half-Life 2 will run fine turned up to max, and they're probably going to look as good as a lot of still modern games turned down to medium. Now because it's an old game, the texture quality doesn't look good when you get up close, the characters' facial animations aren't that great, but when you actually look at how the game runs, characters turn to look at each other when they talk, and the actual monsters have got really good AI. A lot of them will go into cover, some of them will just leap at you and then retreat when they're wounded. It works really well. The game mechanics are flawless, and for that you can excuse the old graphics. Now the plot of Half-Life 2 continues straight on after Half-Life. Well, it doesn't, because there's a period of time when the character Gordon Freeman is in limbo. And what happens while you're in limbo is the Combine takes over the world. So when the G-Man wakes you up, you basically have to try and save the world. Now if G-Man, Combine and anything else doesn't make any sense, well, that's okay. Basically if you've not played Half-Life, none of that will make any sense. But the previous events in the Half-Life game are all explained at the start of Half-Life 2. You don't really need to have played Half-Life to play Half-Life 2. Now there is a re-engineered version of Half-Life coming out, and when that's completed and released then it's probably worth playing Half-Life. Until then I would actually just play Half-Life 2. Now Half-Life did also get two sequels, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Now the reason there's been such a stink over Half-Life 3 is that when Episode 1 and Episode 2 were in development they were called Half-Life 3. But because there was no advancement in the engine, they decided to release them as episodes of Half-Life 2. But don't get them confused, it's not Half-Life 2 is in two parts, Episode 1 and Episode 2. The order runs Half-Life 2, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Half-Life 2 Episode 2. They each follow on from the other. So Episode 1 isn't Episode 1 of Half-Life 2, it's essentially Episode 1 of Half-Life 3, that's why it's called Episode 1. It's a very complicated naming schedule, but basically if you go Half-Life 2, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 and Half-Life 2 Episode 2, you're getting them in the right order. So with all this content, why do I think that Fear is better than Half-Life? Well, it's simply the fact that the story in Fear is just better than the story in Half-Life. Story in Half-Life is kind of incidental. It's nice to follow, but it doesn't really affect the gameplay. Half-Life works to a very predictable formula. A bit of story, quite a bit of action. A bit of story, quite a bit of action. They don't mix together. Once you're out doing the fighting, running around trying to find your way to where you're going, then the story is incidental. When you get to where you're going, you'll get some more story. But in between those events, it's just action. Now the action is pretty good. As a shooter, Half-Life 2 is really solid. Maybe the pistols are too good because they are pretty much just laser beams. The HEV suit that you're wearing is kind of like an environmental hazard suit, and it does compensate for recoil, which means with controlled fire the pistols have no recoil whatsoever. You can do some amazingly long shots with a semi-auto pistol and the Magnum. Now you end up carrying a couple of different guns in each slot, so I think you end up with being able to carry about 8 guns and then some grenades, and of course you've got the crowbar, which is kind of the signature of Half-Life and you get at the end of the first level of Half-Life 2. And if you're experienced with shooters these days, well, you're probably going to want to ratchet up the difficulty on Half-Life 2. I decided I'd play some to record this video and I ended up playing about 12 hours. I got really into it again. But the gunplay is far too easy on the easy difficulties, or it's not even easy, I think it's medium difficulty that it sets it to. So you want to crank up the difficulty if you've got any experience with shooters. Now Half-Life and Half-Life 2 have brought us so many first person shooter memes that when you start playing it you think, oh, that's ripped off from this game, or that's taken from this game. Well, no, Half-Life 2 and Half-Life made a lot of these memes up. So things like exploding barrels are pretty much perfected in Half-Life 2 because it's got a really good physics engine and it's got really good exploding barrels. And it's also got a gravity gun, which has been done in a lot of games but was never done as well as it was in Half-Life 2 in my opinion. And you've got the obligatory get on a jet boat, get on a buggy sections. Those are all pretty standard these days, but Half-Life and Half-Life 2 set out the format for shooters. It's just that some shooters have done it better since. So while they are key to the development of shooters, recommending Half-Life is a bit like recommending going to play Doom. These days it's just a bit dated. Now Half-Life 2 isn't exactly new, it was released in 2008 and it's on an engine that's pretty obsolete because Valve just don't seem to make games anymore. But it's had a lot of tweaks and developments over the years. A lot of those are included in what you download from Steam. So Half-Life 2 is a perfectly playable, perfectly good shooter with a decent story. And it'll run on almost anything. That's why I recommend Half-Life 2. It's just not quite good enough to be the top of my list.